What does your neighborhood look like? What kind of house do you live in, and when was it built? Do you live in a white neighborhood, a Black or Latinx neighborhood, a mixed race neighborhood? Do you live in your city's version of Chinatown, or its version of Hollywood Hills? Instead of a city, do you live in the suburbs or out in the country? And are your neighbors mostly the same race as you? As you think about these questions, add another. Why does your neighborhood look this way? In particular, if most people around you have the same race, did that just happen naturally with the flow of people in and out of a region? Do the Chinatowns and the Bronzevilles or Harlems of U.S. cities and the all-white towns in the rural Midwest, such as the one where I grew up, happen just because Chinese people and Black people like to live with each other and don't want to mix amongst white people, as some have suggested? The answer to that is very much a no. And this tour of the two neighborhoods surrounding North Park University will describe one of the factors that caused single-race neighborhoods to dominate the U.S. landscape in the 20th century, and give a few reasons that landscape hasn't changed even into the 21st century. We'll finish up with some ways for you to explore other areas and neighborhoods, and to look into other reasons for the racial segregation that is an unavoidable part of modern American life, but not an unchangeable one. Racial segregation of neighborhoods, and the benefits some neighborhoods may enjoy or rights that might be denied in others, are parts of the U.S. race-based caste system. And housing segregation, just like other aspects of that caste system, was written into law. This abbreviated timeline will give you both an overview and some specific examples of such laws. Slavery, of course, had existed long before Europeans colonized the Americas. But in the late 1600s, courts in the American colonies passed laws that first limited slavery to non-Europeans and then clarified that freedom from slavery would be based on, quote, whiteness, a new concept which they related to European ancestry. It took 2 centuries for northern states to abolish slavery, and another couple of decades for the United States to fight a war over slavery, abolish most of it, and write that abolition into the Constitution in 1865, along with the right of formerly enslaved men to citizenship and voting. Less than a decade later, white people in former slave states went about dismantling the new constitutional rights of formerly enslaved people with domestic terrorism and state and local laws that limited where Black people could go to church, where they could sit and eat, how and if they could vote, and where they were allowed to live, among many other details of their lives. The Great Migration, beginning in the 1930s, saw waves of Black people moving to the northern U.S. to escape persecution and terrorism on top of the looming Great Depression. Because of a permissive 1926 decision of the Supreme Court, restrictive housing covenants took off like wildfire, especially in these cities of the northern U.S. Black people were prohibited by local laws and by white vigilante gangs from moving into most neighborhoods in most cities. Places outside the cities, like the one where I grew up in rural Indiana, were so hostile to Black migrants that the vast majority of those migrants moved into cities, despite a number of them having well-established expertise in farming. Cities took on a more and more segregated appearance, quite unlike their aspect at the turn of the century. Meanwhile, a New Deal organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, originally created to help keep people from getting foreclosed during the Great Depression, provided a new federal service for bankers and lenders, maps of U.S. cities to guide banks and housing lenders to areas with the, quote, best return on investment, shaded green, versus those that were, quote, hazardous to investment, shaded red. As we will see, these decisions on which neighborhoods were best and which were hazardous were based largely on racist thinking, creating what is now called the redlining of non-white neighborhoods and blocking the flow of money and investment into those neighborhoods. Decades later, because of long-standing civil rights struggles, A number of federal and state and local laws were passed to fix these injustices. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed employment discrimination and race-based segregation of schools. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. But while such laws were being hard-won, opponents were already finding ways around them. For example, so-called segregation academies sprung up to move white students out of public schools that were being desegregated. By privatizing or claiming religious purposes, these schools bypassed the Civil Rights Act and other local laws. In housing, zoning laws replaced the now illegal race-based housing covenants and the defunct HOLC maps. Zoning laws don't mention race, but since they often work to ensure that a neighborhood retains its current character, they have served to keep white neighborhoods white in many towns and cities in the U.S. What we'll do now is look at the HOLC map for Chicago, which was completed in 1940. First off, if you type mapping inequality into your search engine and look for the response that comes from Richmond University, it'll say something like dsl.richmond.edu, then click on the mapping inequality link. The site will ask you for some permissions the first time, and then we'll go to your neighborhood or to the one nearest a city that was mapped out by the HOLC. In these maps, neighborhoods were graded and shaded with green for A, or best, blue for B, or still desirable, yellow for C, or definitely declining, and red for D, or hazardous. These maps were where we get the term redlining. The Sauganash neighborhood, graded A, is just a bit northwest of North Park University. Despite transportation and shopping facilities being termed not good in the report, and despite a 9% decline in housing prices, the neighborhood is one of the best residential communities within the city limits of Chicago, they say, and is attracting a, quote, good class of homeowner. And what is a good class of homeowner? We can show what they mean by contrasting the red line neighborhood of Bronzeville. Bronzeville was one of those rare neighborhoods in Chicago that black travelers from the Great Migration were allowed to settle. On the HOLC form, Bronzeville got an entire extra page of text describing what made it hazardous for loans. They say that it is a, quote, blighted area, 100% Negro, end quote, and that the Ida B. Wells housing project should have been located elsewhere, quote, in order to keep the colored influence as far as possible from further encroaching on park and lake water frontage, end quote. The text repeats itself about where this project should have been located, which seems quite irrelevant after the fact that the project had already been built. Quote, with approximately 6,500 colored people moving into this district, it is evident they cannot be closed in. They must have an outlet, and the problem of keeping park and water frontage close by, reasonably free of them, will be difficult to surmount. End quote. This description makes it abundantly clear that the good class of homeowner referred to in Sauganash was intended by the assessors to mean not black. What about the neighborhoods with the two middle classifications? Those are the categories in the neighborhoods around North Park University. If we look at neighborhoods B64, known as North Park, and C55, which looks like a 56 but is a 55 and is known as Albany Park, we are seeing the spot at the dividing line where North Park University lies. Once you click on a neighborhood in this digitized version of the map, a placard pops up with a description. If you click Show Scan, you'll see the original typewritten page of the assessment. If you are not seeing that option, then those originals from your city may not have been preserved or found. The top half of the description has details such as what types of building materials are most common for the two most common types of housing in the area. the costs of buying and renting that housing, and changes in those costs over the last few years leading up to 1940. The bottom half will have a description giving the HOLC assessor's impression of the neighborhood. Here are some excerpts from it. Quote,
although properties in this section are of substantial appearance and common good rentals, the general trend of the neighborhood is definitely downward because of the marked infiltration of Jewish. Albany Park is feeling the infiltration of somewhat lower-class Jewish families from southwest Chicago. Many of the stores on Lawrence and Kedzie are typical fish market and shoestring business operations. One reason for the good rentals obtainable is because of excellent elevated transportation ending at Lawrence and Kimball. The grading of the area is penalized because of the class of occupancy and a very marked downward trend.
End quote. By contrast, the B64, or North Park neighborhood, just north of the university, is given a still desirable B grade. The HOLC assessors say that, quote,
this neighborhood is feeling the influence of the Jewish section adjoining on the south. Mortgage lenders are not too anxious to lend in the area because of heavy foreclosure in the neighboring area. Properties are fairly good, however, and many are in first-class condition. But the threatening infiltration is hurting this area. Transportation is inconvenient, and for the elevated ends at Lawrence and Kimball, rentals in two-family units are not as high as in the area to the south because of location, but sales prices are somewhat better.
End quote. A few years ago, I started researching homes in the North Park and Albany Park neighborhoods to see which had been there for these HOLC assessors, and to imagine what the neighborhoods might have looked like to them. All of the homes and businesses in the rest of this tour had been built by the time that those maps were created. This table has information taken from the tops of the B64 and C55 assessor forms, giving the two most common housing types in each of these neighborhoods. They are remarkably similar so far. In fact, if you walk the streets in North Park and Albany Park, you'll see homes similar to many Chicago neighborhoods. First, there are two flats, designed for 2 or 3 families to each own a floor. That third floor would be the so-called English basement or half basement. This is basically a condo building on a very small scale and would have provided a less expensive option for homeowners than a single-family home. Here are the boundaries of the HOLC areas, B64 and C55, overlaid on a current satellite image from Google Maps. The two flats we're about to see are the two highlighted orange markers. First, in B64, and then this one in C55. They're very similar, and they're probably like many you've seen if you've walked Chicago streets. Next, a very common single-family home at the time would have been what is now called the Chicago bungalow. Chicago bungalows were built by the tens of thousands between 1910 and 1930 to accommodate the narrow lot sizes in the city and yet provide a spacious home. They are brick-faced with stone trim and have the front entry offset or off to the side, such as the one on the left here from C55 with its side entrance, and the one on the right from B64 with its offset entrance. Here are 2 more. This one from B64 and this one from C55. Remember, everything I'm showing you today are homes that would have been there when the HOLC assessor was filling out that form. I wondered if having architect-designed homes would give a neighborhood a boost for the HOLC assessors. I went to the Chicago Landmarks site and found that both B64 and C55 had a smattering of architect-designed homes and buildings, including some on North Park University's campus. For example, This two-flat in B64, with its lovely side entrance awning, was designed by Oscar Johnson in the 1920s and would have been about 15 years old at the time of the HOLC assessment. This gorgeous single family in C55 was designed by Axel Thiessen and was about the same age as the two-flat in B64. As I pulled more information from the top half of the HOLC forms, I saw that the ages of the homes were pretty similar. Older in C55 by only a few years on average, such as these two homes from the 1920s. This one in B64, and this very similar one in C55. I was puzzled to see that while C55, Albany Park, was commanding overall higher prices and increasing in value by about 12%, compared to B64 or North Park's 5% decrease from 2 years previous. And that didn't seem to match with the grades those two neighborhoods got. Perhaps it was the other buildings, so I looked at apartment buildings that would have been around at the time. About 10% of North Park homes and 20% of Albany Park buildings weren't single-family or 2 or 3 or 4 flats. Some were apartment buildings, such as this 28-unit building built in 1931 in B64, and this 14-unit building built in 1925 in C55. Both would have been brand new apartment buildings at the time. Yet, the assessors predicted that sales in B64 would remain good, and those in C55 would trend down. And then they explained why they predicted this in the lower part of the form. The infiltration that they refer to in B64 is filled in on another line in the form as Jewish, and is described as coming from the neighborhood to the south, that is, C55. C55 is given its bad grade and bad predictions based on the ethnicity of its residents. Lawrence and Kedzie, the shopping streets mentioned dismissively in the C55 description, were likely immigrant-run or with immigrant clientele. Just to remind you of the context of the day, Jewish Europeans had been fleeing increasingly anti-Semitic laws across Europe, then the rise of Nazism in Germany, and, by the time of the map's publication, outright war in Europe. Lawrence today is also filled with shops, many run by or catering to recently immigrated populations, from Koreans a few decades ago to South Asians and Latin Americans more recently. The map makers dismissed those shops as fish markets and shoestring business operations. I want to finish this tour by encouraging you not to dismiss today's shops and shop owners. One way I like to do that, other than the more obvious going shopping or eating in the area, is to look up at the buildings themselves. Reminding myself of the architecture of the buildings that house these shops reminds me to appreciate the street and the business owners that keep it vibrant and keep those buildings alive. Built in the 1930s in the Gothic and Classical styles, this building was designed by Albert Ruttenberg and was a True Value Hardware for a while. It now houses a linens and bedding store, Golden Linen. Notice the light green or blue-green window decorations made of terracotta. Architectural terracotta was very popular in rebuilding Chicago from after the Great Fire and on into the 1960s. There was a whole town in Illinois called Terracotta, near Crystal Lake, where the American Terracotta Company made inexpensive molded, fireproof architectural terracotta, including polychrome terracotta with the colors and glazes baked on. That's why those colors are still lovely nearly a century later. Built in 1926, this building is another excellent example of terracotta and houses, among other things, a furniture discount store, a cell phone store, and a doctor's office. Again, above the windows on the top story is more beautifully molded terracotta. Here's one of my favorites, the Fish Furniture Building. It was built in 1931 with terracotta ornamentation. It was the Fish Furniture Company's 9th location but the only one where they used the actual fish of their name as ornamentation on the building. These fish are at the very top of the building's facade. If you're on campus, this building is at the corner of Christiana and Lawrence, which you've likely passed on your way to or from the train. This facade is easiest to see from across the street, right around where the produce stand usually sets up on Lawrence. More fish are between the upper windows. This is maybe a bearded carp, or if you have a wild imagination like mine, a dragon. The Fish Furniture Company now only exists in Indianapolis, and today this building houses a blood bank. Finally, built in the 1920s and designed by the Danish-American architect Jens Jensen in the Second Renaissance Revival style, this building houses a clothing store on its first level. Look up for the facade balustrade and that amazing terracotta green over the windows on the right. And on the street view, you'll see more magnificent glazed green terracotta, which complements what would have been the latest technology in printing the name of the building, the Willis Building, on glass, and the much more modern, current edition of colorful graffiti. So what from here? This all happened in 1940, and surely we would never say things such as the things said on those HOLC maps today. First, let's note that those maps were used until the 70s to determine who could and could not get mortgages and in what neighborhoods. After that, any zoning laws in effect still meant that whatever had been built in these neighborhoods was what would be built in the future. So if you remember that 2-flat on Spalding in B64, it's now been converted into a single-family home. It last sold in 2005 for $700,000. Just a few blocks south on the same street, this 2-flat is still a 2-flat, last sold in 2004 for $480,000. Of course, there are many factors that make one home expensive and another less so, such as which school you could get your kids into if you lived in one house versus another. But it is very interesting that the brand new school, Northside Prep, was built in the B64 neighborhood instead of the C55 one. Investment breeds further investment, but the HOLC maps give a stark example of the long-term consequences of disinvestment in neighborhoods with residents that the assessors did not consider to be the best class of white. There are two basic ways to follow up on this tour. One is to learn more, and the other is to find out what other people are doing and see if you can support them in some way. First, you could learn about your own history. Explore what the HOLC map assessors had to say about your neighborhood, and find a neighborhood nearby that got a different grade than yours. Compare what was the same or what was different in the housing or housing prices, and what was the same or different in the written description part of the form. If you don't live in a city, either pick the nearest city or the one you've visited the most, or else research your town or county's local history with housing covenants and zoning laws. If you're from an all-white area with no obvious covenants, such as the one where I grew up, look to see if there are historical records of the Klan, the White League, or other anti-Black organizing in your area. For example, my state had a Klan Day at the state fair right around the time the Great Migration was kicking into high gear. You could also learn more about modern trends that are giving the same results that the redlining of the 1930s did. For example, WBEZ and the City Bureau just collaborated to analyze data that's required of banks by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, along with U.S. Census data for Chicago. And they showed that just one white neighborhood in Chicago, Lakeview, for example, received more mortgage money between 2012 and 2018 than all of the majority Black neighborhoods of Chicago put together. Or cast a wider net and go more in depth to learn about not only the history of redlining, but also other laws that built up the racism of the U.S. today. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and Caste by Isabel Wilkerson are good, in-depth looks at the race-based caste system in the U.S. and how it has been encoded into law. Each has been on a podcast or two recently, if you want a brief audio introduction to their work. If some of the information in this tour was new to you, the entire second season of Seen on Radio is devoted to understanding how the concept of race and whiteness, or non-whiteness, was invented and played out in U.S. history. If you want to do something, you might want to research what other people are doing in the U.S. today to change the impacts of redlining and other current or historic racist systems. For example, in Minneapolis, zoning laws locked HOLC inequities into place. Tackling the resulting housing disparities would also positively impact climate change, but the action would have to start now. Community groups there are pushing the city to hold to its 2040 plan and make those changes a reality. One of the best ways that you can make changes is to find a group that is working on the change you want to see and volunteer your own gifts and skills to them.